You're listening to Public Sports Announcement with your host, Stephen Baltiera.
Welcome in, everybody, to another edition of Public Sports Announcement. I'm your host, Stephen Baltiera, and today we're going to take a quick break from MLB, NBA, NFL news. We've spent most of this show talking about that stuff, and it's all great, and I love it, and I love covering all sports because sports is my life. But today I'm going to cover and have a special edition of a sport that is really dear to my heart that I don't talk about enough, but it's a big week for the sport. And that is MMA and the UFC. This week is UFC 223. We're going to be getting into Khabib Nurmagomedov versus Max Holloway for the lightweight title, and the co-main event, which is Joanna Jędrzejczyk versus Rose Namajunas for the women's strawweight title. It's a big event, probably one of the biggest events of the year for the UFC. This is a huge event in terms of, star power. So let's go ahead and let's jump into it. But let me lead off with this. And that is that the UFC is at the changing of a guard. They no longer can relate or rely on Ronda Rousey or Conor McGregor. They're looking for a new star desperately. Ronda Rousey and Conor McGregor were global icons for 2 years. From 2015 all the way through 2016, and sometime a little bit in 2017 when Conor McGregor faced Floyd Mayweather. But during that time when Conor McGregor left the UFC in 2017, they struggled. They struggled to find their star. Jon Jones was one of the biggest, if not the best, fighters in the UFC of all time. But outside the octagon, he has proven to not be responsible enough to carry the load of superstardom. So last year, they were scrambling. They would put on fights. They'd do okay. Conor McGregor has so much leverage over the UFC and Dana White, it's not even funny. But this week is something unique. Because when I look at this week's fights, and I look at who's fighting, someone has a chance to take that next step and become that star the UFC is so desperately seeking. Now, on April 1st, the UFC announced that Tony Ferguson, who was the interim lightweight champ for the UFC, was pulled out of the card because of a knee injury, a freak injury he suffered in the Fox Sports media day, and he can no longer fight Khabib Nurmagomedov. Now, this was the original main event of UFC 223. He was declared he couldn't fight. Everybody was kind of bummed out. People were like, is this an April Fool's joke? No one really knew what was going on, but he can no longer fight. And now Khabib is facing the featherweight champion of the UFC, Max Holloway, who is taking this fight on 1 week notice. And I think this is an interesting fight either way, because although Tony Ferguson was the original main event and people were bummed that he's not going to be able to fight Khabib, and that was the third time they've tried to make that fight, Max Holloway has a chance to become the next star of the UFC. And I say that because Max Holloway hasn't reached his potential yet. Now, he's knocked out the former featherweight champ Jose Aldo twice already. During this run he's had, he's won about 11 straight fights in a row in the featherweight division, one of the longest active win streaks in the UFC. But he's taking the fight against a guy who was undefeated his whole entire career in Khabib Nurmagomedov. Khabib is 26-0 right now. And Max Holloway, if he's able to beat Khabib on 1 week notice in one of the biggest cards in the UFC history, he will instantly become a global icon. Now, the funny thing about this is, do you know who Max Holloway's last loss came to? It was in 2013 to none other than Conor McGregor. Conor McGregor, when he was still a featherweight at the time, and he was ascending up, superstardom, beat Max Holloway and beat him pretty unanimously. But that is one of the only fights where Conor McGregor did not finish an opponent in the octagon. And that was Max Holloway, a young Max Holloway at that point too. Now, if Max Holloway can pull out this improbable win, this will set up a mega rematch between Max Holloway and Conor McGregor, who is expected to return sometime later this year. And if he's able to return and fight Max Holloway for that lightweight title, that would be one of the biggest matches in UFC history and something that Dana White cannot turn down. Now, Max Holloway is still currently the featherweight champion of the UFC. But the money that will be generated if a Max Holloway versus Conor McGregor 155 bout happens would be insane. On the flip side, if Khabib wins this fight and he improves to 27-0, never been beaten in the octagon, and him and Conor McGregor have traded words on social media. I mean, but social media is social media. You can only put so much meaning behind that. But if he wins this fight, no doubt, Khabib versus Conor is just as big. Now, this card means a lot on a lot of different levels for the UFC. This is a chance to generate the next biggest star in the UFC, to move on past Conor. Because right now, Conor is laughing. Another fighter pulled out of a fight in Tony Ferguson. This was a good chance for him to step in, but he didn't. Kind of questions whether or not he's ready or not. But if Max Holloway can do this, or Khabib, no matter who wins this fight, the UFC is on the verge of breeding their next big star. We're going to go ahead and jump into this card. The press conference is actually underway right now in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. So we might take a little look at that, might see what's going on there. But undoubtedly, this is one of the biggest cards in UFC history. You have Max Holloway versus Khabib Nurmagomedov, Rose Namajunas versus Joanna Jędrzejczyk. Whenever they stack two title fights in the co-main event and the main event of a card, you know it's a pretty big card. They're also having the 25th UFC anniversary press conference on Friday. We'll get into some of those and some of the fights coming up in the future for the UFC. But undoubtedly, this is one of the biggest fight weeks in UFC history. When we come back from our short music break, we're going to go ahead and dive into this card and some other possible fights that might be coming on the way. You're listening to Public Sports Announcement only on Zoo Radio.